Our chapter talk this week covers audience adaptation. 3 key learning objectives. First, identify audience demographics. Those are the general characteristics that are measurable. Secondly, identify audience psychographics. This is a lot harder to measure. This is the beliefs, the attitudes, the motives of your audience. And then thirdly, adjust your message to the speaking situation. So lots to cover this week. I will try to be concise yet thorough. So our first objective, identify audience demographics. You will see 8 items listed in front of you: age, gender, sexual orientation, education, race and culture, socioeconomic status, and group affiliations. These are the 8 indicators that are oftentimes measurable. So let's take a peek at each. First, we need to look at age. As a communicator, we need to consider the age of our listener. Now, there's some general assumptions that have been made through the years, and that is the younger the age, the more open your audience. And inversely, the greater the age, the less open. There is some truth to you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? I've heard them all from my parents and grandparents. I wasn't born yesterday. I'm old and set in my ways. And typically people with increased age, they want comfort. They want the social order that comes with that and the predictability. So again, decreased age equals increased openness. But I think what's most insightful to a speaker is to understand where their audience lands in terms of generations. There are 5 generations right now in the workplace, which is just wildly fascinating. We have first our traditionalists. These are the individuals born before 1945. You may also hear them referred to as matures. These individuals relatively prefer exclusively face-to-face communication and certainly will talk on the phone to those within their inner circle. The second then is baby boomers, which is more important because there are still several boomers in the workforce. This roughly makes up close to 35% of the current workforce right now. Boomers were those born between 1945 and 1960. This is where my parents land. They are the post-World War II babies, the 1960s, the Woodstock, the shift in culture, very family-oriented. Now, boomers typically prefer phone conversations. They want to talk on the phone, even more so than face-to-face. The words truly matter. Thirdly, we have Generation X. This is my generation, those born between 61 and 81, approximately. So the Gen X group makes up close to 33% of the workforce, give or take. You can find data pretty much everywhere on this, but typically it's roughly 30-30-30 split between boomers, Gen X, and millennials in terms of who's in the workforce. So my generation was that first generation of latchkey kids, that population that for the first time came home to an empty house, unlocked the door, went in, and got themselves a snack. And there was probably a note left for mom and dad or something on a marker board about the chores that needed to be done or what to get ready for supper. That was certainly my life. Now, Gen Xers as a whole love visuals, like mom's whiteboard. We love PowerPoint. We love email messages. These are preferred communication outlets. Next, we have millennials. Again, millennials make up about 30% of the workforce. Millennials are digital natives. They want freedom. They want flexibility. They work with people. They don't work for people. This generation is the first to grow up with technology. So from that, they have become very flexible in nature and have embraced the freedom that comes with it. And then lastly, we have Gen Z. Those are the folks born after 96 that are currently in the workforce. Gen Z is really dependent upon technology. It isn't an option, it is necessary. Gen Z typically is less concerned about security and stability. Gen Z prefers to communicate with social network platforms. It might be multiple social media outlets, but that would be preferred. While also Gen Z still has some interest in face-to-face communication. So that is just a quick look at age and how that plays in to your listener. Next comes gender and sexual orientation. Now I'm putting these two together because the one lends to the other. Gender and sexual orientation. Let's look at gender first from a traditional standpoint. Now, there is a lot of research in history that indicates that traditional male-female roles communicate differently. And there is some value in this. Our text, as well as many communication theorists, would say that women typically are more open and additionally more caring or emotional in how they communicate, more aimed at connection. Our text also states that men are the contrast. They are often less open, more logical, and less emotional in their communication styles. Now, these are good things to remember when we're speaking to a general audience, but we can never assume gender, which leads me to sexual orientation. In today's workplace, there is no fixed identity. We assume nothing when we look at someone in terms of how their physical representation is either male or female. In order to do that, we need to first learn and identify with the person, not their outer shell. And a big piece of workplace communication, as well as public speaking, is the preferred pronoun. How does somebody want to be referred to? Now, my personal pronouns are she, her, hers. The next person sitting next to me may look like me on the outer shell and may prefer they, them, theirs. Simple things like name tags that you see before you or email signatures are a great way to bridge that gap and alleviate what could potentially be an awkward conversation. But I will tell you, I challenge you to have the awkward conversation, because the more we talk about this, the more we get over, I don't know how to ask, I don't know how to say, the more we can communicate effectively and ethically to everybody, regardless of their sexual orientation. And the last thing I want to say on this is, when in doubt, use the, use the plural pronoun. If you're speaking to an audience that is of mixed population of male and female, and you're not sure how they identify, use the they, them, theirs versus he or she, his or hers pronouns. Okay, next up is education. Education, okay, some key assumptions that may be safe, and I put a little asterisk by that. Our text advocates that education, those individuals who are educated in an audience, you can somewhat safely assume that they have increased openness and they are more informed. And really, that's just from taking reps. Taking this class right now and learning, you are educating yourself and you're opening your mind to different thoughts, theories, and ideas. So typically with an increased education merits increased openness. And then secondly, informed. Typically people who are in the workforce, who are educated, are up to date on current events and what's going on somewhat in politics and social issues and so forth. The things we are not safe to assume: do not assume that you understand someone's politics because you are aware of their education. In the past, it was thought that a more highly educated person typically tied themselves to a more conservative political life, and vice versa. Now, in our current work state, there is no safe assumption. It is very blurred. There are educated and uneducated people on both sides of politics. And then lastly, do not assume income. Education is not directly tied to higher salary. While there's definitely data to state it is, we cannot assume because somebody is educated, they're in the upper class. Nextly, let's look at race and culture. Okay, race and culture. A couple things we are safe to assume. Safe assumptions: increased openness and increased level of informed, okay? And typically people who are of different races and cultures have a level of openness and tolerance, and they are informed. Things we cannot assume are politics. Culture and race are certainly not linked to politics, and they're certainly not linked to income. So there's a couple key words here. Symbolic racism. Symbolic racism happens when we unnecessarily tag a cultural reference to a word. So if I said something like that black doctor or this white cop, I am inherently tagging a race reference to the statement. So we want to remove any symbolic racism. Instead of saying black doctor, we can say the doctor, the pediatrician. Instead of saying that white cop, the police officer. Remove all ties to race. And then the other word we really need to be careful for is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, sorry, it's a mouthful. And that is just the tendency to think that your culture is the only one that is correct. And you look to the world and think your life, your way of being is right, and other perspectives are wrong. Now, ethnocentrism, we need to first become aware of it when we have ideas that support this. And then we need to open our minds, educate ourselves, and combat that. Because people can fall into ethnocentric thinking without even realizing they are there. Okay, and then we have two other demographics. Socioeconomic status. Okay, socioeconomic status is really where you stand in the social class. Now, assumptions. Typically, you will see lower, middle, upper class. Please assume that there are more than 3 classes. There are lower classes, there are working classes, there are working lower classes, there are working middle class, and there's working upper class. Now, this is the best representation. This was taken from the U.S. Census Bureau in 2020. Oftentimes, though, if you look over here, you will see how our classes are arranged in 3. So please don't assume that there are only 3 classes. In the past, people fall to thinking we're all in the middle class, and there is a lot of people who are working like dogs, and we assume that they're covering the bases and are in that middle class. But lower middle class individuals might be finding out, okay, how am I going to finance this textbook? Even though they are perceived as the middle class, they might be picking up extra hours to purchase that textbook or purchase a uniform for their job. So there's variations within. So do not assume that we're all in the middle class. And then lastly, do not assume the economic class of the listener. Okay, keep that in mind when you're addressing an audience. Make sure your message is all encompassing and not assuming that we all share the same socioeconomic status. And then lastly, we have group affiliations. Okay, group affiliations are that they're groups. Groups are 3 or more people, and these groups specifically represent something. And oftentimes they provide insight into psychographics, the values, the beliefs. So group affiliations include first occupational. Okay, so occupational, a couple different occupational groups. You'll see UPS. Their union is called the Teamsters. And then below that, you'll see SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. Now, if I was going to present benefits information to a group of UPS employees, I would probably take the time to make sure they understood acronyms and definitions and the overall package. Whereas if I was presenting the same information to human resource management professionals, I would understand that this is what they do. They share, they explain benefits to employees. So I would take that information and I would cater it to the audience. Okay, so that's an example of occupational groups. Secondly, we see political. Okay, we see the good old right versus left here. Now, we never want to make assumptions about political groups, but if we understand there is a general consensus of political leanings in our audience, I would make sure you understand the key thinking behind major hot button issues, gun control, immigration, healthcare, things of that nature, to understand their perspective. Next, we have religious groups. Okay. It has been assumed in the past that with increased religion comes an increased level of conservatism. And that is not always correct, but does hold true for some audiences. So if you are speaking to a group of Muslims, if you are speaking to a group of Buddhist monks or a group of Christians, again, research what their religion and culture is all about. What do they value? Who do they worship? Have an understanding of that before you present the information. And then lastly, we have social groups. And those oftentimes are linked to political, but they are not innately political. So for example, the National Rifle Association, who upholds amendment rights of bearing arms. Or PETA, who are protecting the rights of animals. So these are all group affiliations. So I am going to pause here and I will begin a second recording of the remainder of week 6 chapter talk. To be continued.